The coast of Normandy never truly sleeps, but it dreams. That's what Wilhelm Kress thought on the night of June 5, 1944. The fortifications were real, steel and concrete and barbed wire and mines. But the men manning them existed in a kind of half-sleep, eyes open, but minds somewhere else, somewhere safer. Somewhere that wasn't a concrete bunker 40 meters above the sea, waiting for something that never came. Kress was 38 years old, lean in the way that men become lean when they've been at war too long. His uniform was Wehrmacht gray, the collar marked with the insignia of a Hauptsturmführer, captain, with enough campaign medals to tell a story nobody wanted to hear. Poland, France, Russia. And now this, Normandy, the defensive line, the waiting wall. He stood on the observation platform at Pointe du Hoc, a stone's throw from the artillery battery that sat in concrete casings on the bluff. The English Channel lay below like a dark mirror, reflecting nothing but itself. Somewhere across that water was England. Somewhere beyond that were the Americans. But tonight, the channel was empty. It had been empty for months. Since the spring, intelligence reports had been flooding in. The Allies were coming. Not maybe, not eventually. They were coming. And they were coming soon. The reports came from Berlin, from Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, from Division Command. The Americans and British were assembling a massive invasion force in England. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of troops. The invasion would come any day now. Any day. For 6 months. The men had stopped believing it. They'd reinforced the positions, poured concrete, laid minefields, strung barbed wire, built the Atlantic Wall, Berlin's grand defense that was supposed to be impenetrable. But as weeks turned into months, as the invasion never came, the men began to believe it never would. The Allies didn't have what it took. The Americans were soft. Their equipment was inferior. German tactical brilliance would hold the line. Kress had heard the speeches. Every German officer had. The Reich was unsinkable. The new weapons would turn the tide. The Americans were incapable of conducting a real amphibious invasion. German science, German engineering, German discipline, these would prevail. He believed none of it. Kress had fought long enough to understand the difference between what Berlin said and what reality demanded. He'd been in France during the collapse of 1940, and he'd seen how quickly certainty could turn to chaos. He'd been in Russia, watching the endless steppes swallow division after division of Wehrmacht soldiers. He'd learned that no amount of discipline could overcome bad logistics, that no ideology could survive contact with winter and enemy artillery. He was studying the water through binoculars when Lieutenant Dietrich appeared beside him. The young officer was from Berlin, 23 years old, sharp-faced, with the kind of nervous energy that came for seeing the war go badly and not understanding why. Dietrich had been assigned to the Normandy coast 3 weeks ago, and he'd spent every day since walking the defensive positions and making notes and trying to understand the tactical situation. "Sir, the radio from division. They're reporting unusual activity in the English ports, increased boat movements, ship concentrations." Kress lowered his binoculars. "Increased compared to what?" "Compared to the normal pattern, sir. Operation says it could indicate an imminent invasion attempt." "They've been saying that since March." "Yes, sir, but tonight's report is marked urgent. They're saying reconnaissance has identified a significant acceleration in embarkation procedures." Kress turned back to the water. The channel was still empty. The stars were still visible above it. The night was quiet, except for the distant sound of waves against the rocks below. "Tell them we'll maintain full alertness. And Dietrich, get some sleep. You won't be sleeping much after tonight." "Sir?" "The invasion is coming. Not maybe, not soon, tonight, or tomorrow night, but it's coming. Dietrich's face went pale. How do you know? Because they don't send urgent messages about port activity for nothing. Because Berlin's been wrong about timing for 6 months, but they've never been wrong about the fact that it's coming. And because I can feel it. Kress couldn't explain the last part. It wasn't something officers were supposed to say. But 38 years old in wartime meant Kress had learned to trust his instincts. And his instincts were screaming. The two men stood in silence, watching the empty channel. Around them, the fortifications of Pointe du Hoc sat dark and quiet. Below, on the beach, the defenses were in place. Anti-tank obstacles, machine gun nests, minefields. Everything Berlin had said would make the position impregnable. Kress didn't feel impregnable. He felt like a man standing in front of a wave. By midnight, the orders had come down from division. Full alert. All units to man defensive positions. This was not a drill. The invasion was coming. The men moved with practiced efficiency. They'd done this before, dozens of times over the past 6 months. But this time, something was different. Maybe it was the tone of the orders. Maybe it was the fact that nobody had to be told twice. Maybe it was the electricity in the air that meant something fundamental was about to change. Kress went his rounds through the positions. The artillery battery crews were in place. The machine gunners had cleared their field of fire. The riflemen were positioned in their defensive posts. Everything was as ready as it could be. He found himself in the command bunker around 2 in the morning, studying the maps with the battalion commander, Major Klaus Richter. Richter was 56 years old, a career officer who'd survived the Weimar Republic, the rise of the Nazis, and 4 years of total war. If anyone was going to maintain perspective tonight, it would be him. "How long until first light?" Kress asked. Richter checked his watch. "About 3 hours. And we still have no specific intelligence about where they'll land?" "Berlin estimates the entire coast from Pas-de-Calais to Brittany. We are responsible for this sector. Our job is to hold until reinforcements arrive." Kress studied the map. Normandy was stretched out in contours and symbols. The beaches were marked. The defensive positions were marked. The estimated locations of German reserves were marked in blue pencil. "How long until reserves reach us?" Kress asked. "If they're mobilized immediately, the 21st Panzer Division is 30 kilometers away. 6 to 8 hours of march time, depending on traffic and air attacks." Kress nodded. 6 to 8 hours. The invasion would start with the dawn. 6 to 8 hours was a long time to hold a beach against an army. "Get some rest, Richter," Kress said. "You've done everything that can be done." He meant it. There was nothing more to prepare. Everything was in place. The question now was whether places could hold against what was coming. Kress walked back to his quarters, a small room carved into a reinforced dugout. He sat on his cot and pulled out a letter he'd started writing to his wife 3 weeks ago. He never finished it. There never seemed to be anything important enough to say. Now he finished it anyway, writing about the weather and the men and how much he missed her. He didn't mention the invasion, or the fear, or the certainty he felt about how this was going to end. He sealed the letter and left it on his desk. If something happened, someone would find it and mail it. The first indication came at 0400 hours, not visually, acoustically. The rumble of distant aircraft engines passing overhead in the darkness. Kress had heard this sound before. Strategic bombing raids on German cities, but this was different. This was concentrated. This was organized. This was heading in one direction. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Yellow tracers streaked upward into the darkness, disappearing into cloud cover. But the aircraft were too high, too numerous, too far away to hit with normal flak. This was saturation bombing, blanket coverage of an area rather than precision strikes on targets. Kress climbed back up to the observation platform. Dietrich was already there, pale-faced, scanning the sky with binoculars. "Paratroopers," Dietrich said. "They must be dropping paratroopers inland. It started." Kress could see the evidence now. The drone of aircraft, the distant sound of explosions inland, off in the direction of Cain. The air itself seemed to vibrate with something vast, moving towards them. "Full alert across the entire position," Kress ordered. "Get runners to each company. I want every man at his post, and somebody get division a sit report." The next hour stretched like pulled taffy. Reports came flooding in. Explosions 15.
By mid-afternoon, the 21st Panzer Division had arrived and launched its counterattack against the American beachhead. Kress listened to the radio reports as the German tanks engaged the American positions. For a moment, there was hope. The Germans were taking losses, but so were the Americans. The counterattack was making progress. Then the American artillery opened up. Not the guns on the ships, those had moved farther offshore, but the artillery that was coming ashore, the American field guns and mortars and howitzers that were beginning to establish their fire bases in the Norman countryside. The 21st Panzer Division was caught in open ground. The German infantry supporting the tanks was caught in open ground. And over 200 American aircraft made low-level attack runs on the forming counterattack. Within an hour, the counterattack had collapsed, not because of tactical failure, but because the Germans didn't have the numbers to overcome American firepower and American reserves. Kress saw the numbers. 21st Panzer Division, approximately 200 tanks and 10,000 troops. American assault force, approximately 6,000 tanks and trucks, landing in the first week alone, with 180,000 troops in the initial assault waves and more coming every day. The math was no longer even close. By evening, the Germans were pulling back to secondary positions. The battle for the beachhead was over. The battle for Normandy was just beginning. Kress received orders to consolidate the remaining forces and prepare for a fighting retreat. The Americans would push inland. The Germans would establish defensive lines and slow the advance. How long this would take depended on factors beyond Kress's control, but he already knew. That night, as darkness fell over the Norman coast, Kress sat in the command bunker and did something he hadn't done since the beginning of the war. He wrote a personal assessment of the military situation. The American invasion force is organized, disciplined, and equipped with industrial capacity that exceeds German capacity by a factor of at least 5-to-1. The American soldiers are well trained and led. The American officer corps is competent. American logistics are functioning at an efficiency that German logistics cannot match. More importantly, the Americans have the capacity to replace losses, repair damage, and deploy reinforcements at a rate that exceeds German capacity. For every American tank destroyed, another will be produced and shipped to Europe. For every American soldier killed, another will be trained and arrive in Europe. For every American aircraft lost, another will be built and flown to the theater. Germany does not have this capacity. Therefore, tactical excellence and brave soldiers cannot overcome strategic defeat. We may slow the American advance. We may inflict heavy casualties. We may even win battles, but we cannot win this war. He sealed the assessment in an envelope and locked it in his personal effects. It was the kind of document that could get a man shot for defeatism. But it was also true. The invasion had shown him something that Berlin had refused to acknowledge. Industrial capacity was the ultimate measure of military power. Not tactics, not courage, not the quality of individual soldiers or officers, but the ability to produce war material in quantities that exceeded the enemy's ability to destroy it. Over the next 72 hours, Kress watched the American beachhead expand. More ships arrived, more supplies were landed, more soldiers came ashore. The Americans began breaking out of their initial perimeter, pushing toward Caen, toward Saint-Lô, toward the interior of France. The German army fought them. Rearguard actions, delaying positions, counterattacks, all the tactics that military textbooks said should work. And for a few hours or a few days, they did work. Germans held positions that should have been overrun. German counterattacks inflicted casualties that should have broken American momentum. But it never mattered, because there were always more Americans coming, always more supplies, always more replacements for losses. Kress kept a personal log of the situation. By June 8th, the Americans had landed over 330,000 troops and 50,000 vehicles. By June 10th, the number had increased to 500,000 troops. The supply dumps on the beaches were growing faster than the Germans could destroy them. American casualties were significant, but replacement soldiers were arriving daily. German casualties were also significant, but replacement soldiers for the Wehrmacht were scarce. The divisions defending Normandy were below strength. Reinforcements from Germany were being moved west, but they were taking days to arrive because the Luftwaffe had been defeated and the American Air Force controlled the skies. Kress did the arithmetic. If the Germans had 300,000 soldiers in Normandy, facing 500,000 American and British troops, and if American troops were arriving at a rate of 100,000 per week, while German reinforcements were arriving at a rate of 20,000 per week, then in 4 weeks the odds would be roughly 600,000 German soldiers facing 900,000 Allied soldiers. Those odds were not survivable. By June 11th, Kress was pulled back to a command post 15 kilometers inland. The beachhead had been fully consolidated. The American breakout was accelerating. The Germans were losing territory and soldiers and equipment with no prospect of replacement. He attended a division commander's briefing where the situation was discussed with the kind of controlled optimism that Berlin demanded. The Americans had been contained. The landing zone had not expanded as quickly as expected. German reserves were moving into position. A counteroffensive was being planned. Victory was still possible. Kress listened and said nothing. He'd learned long ago that questioning the optimism of command was not a viable career path. Instead, he focused on the job in front of him. Defending a line with soldiers who were increasingly exhausted and increasingly aware that they were being asked to hold against an enemy that had superior numbers, superior firepower, and superior logistics. On June 14th, Kress received orders to report to divisional headquarters. He expected a tactical briefing or a situation update. Instead, he found himself in a room with Major Klaus Richter and 2 other senior officers. Richter was smoking a cigarette, something Kress had rarely seen him do. The major looked as if he hadn't slept in 3 days. "Gentlemen," Richter said, "we've been ordered to continue holding this line and to prepare for a counteroffensive that will push the Americans into the sea." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I've read the operational orders. I've reviewed the intelligence estimates, and I've done the math." He looked directly at Kress. "I don't have the capacity to execute this counteroffensive successfully. The German army is already stretched beyond its logistical capacity. The American Air Force controls the skies, which means our reserves can't move during daylight and can't rest during darkness. Our ammunition production is being disrupted by air raids. Our replacement soldiers are arriving in numbers that don't match our losses. And most importantly, the Americans can replace their losses, repair damage, and deploy reinforcements at a rate that exceeds German capacity. For every American tank destroyed, another will be produced and shipped to Europe. For every American soldier killed, another will be trained and arrive in Europe. For every American aircraft lost, another will be built and flown to the theater. Germany does not have this capacity. Therefore, tactical excellence and brave soldiers cannot overcome strategic defeat. We may slow the American advance, we may inflict heavy casualties, we may even win battles, but we cannot win this war. He sealed the assessment in an envelope and locked it in his personal effects. It was the kind of document that could get a man shot for defeatism. But it was also true. The invasion had shown him something that Berlin had refused to acknowledge. Industrial capacity was the ultimate measure of military power. Not tactics, not courage, not the quality of individual soldiers or officers, but the ability to produce war material in quantities that exceeded the enemy's ability to destroy it. Over the next 72 hours, Kress watched the American beachhead expand. More ships arrived, more supplies were landed, more soldiers came ashore. The Americans began breaking out of their initial perimeter, pushing toward Caen, toward Saint-Lô, toward the interior of France. The German army fought them, rearguard actions, delaying positions, counterattacks, all the tactics that military textbooks said should work. And for a few hours or a few days they did work. Germans held positions that should have been overrun. German counterattacks inflicted casualties that should have broken American momentum. But it never mattered, because there were always more Americans coming. By the end of June, the beachhead had expanded to include most of Normandy. Over 1 million Allied troops had landed. American and British forces were linking up and moving toward the Seine. The German army in Normandy was being gradually pushed back, position after position, each one bought with German lives that couldn't be replaced. Kress continued to serve in the defensive positions. He continued to command his soldiers. He continued to follow orders. But he did so with the clear understanding that every day they held a position, they were buying time for the civilian population to evacuate, time for German reserves to organize, time for something to change. Nothing changed. By early August, the German army in Normandy was facing encirclement. The American Third Army had broken through to the south. The German army that had started D-Day with 400,000 soldiers was down to 150,000. The Americans, meanwhile, had landed over 2 million troops by then. The ratio of forces was approaching 20-1. Kress was pulled out of the line and transferred to Rear Area Command. He spent the next several weeks processing retreating soldiers, organizing the movement of remaining equipment, and trying to maintain some semblance of order in a situation that was becoming increasingly chaotic. In mid-August, following the German counterattack at Mortain that failed after 2 days, Kress received orders to retreat toward the Seine. The American encirclement was closing. The surviving German divisions were being pressed into a smaller and smaller pocket. The end of the Normandy campaign was in sight. Standing in a destroyed farmhouse in the Norman countryside, studying maps that showed German positions being eliminated one by one, Kress did the final calculation. The invasion had lasted 74 days. In that time, the Germans had suffered approximately 400,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. German equipment losses totaled over 1,600 tanks, 5,500 vehicles, and hundreds of aircraft. American and British casualties totaled approximately 200,000, with tank losses at approximately 1,000 and vehicle losses at over 5,000. But the critical difference wasn't in the casualties. It was in the replacement rate. By the time the Battle of Normandy ended, American production facilities had replaced every tank lost and added hundreds more to the inventory. German production facilities were under constant air attack and could replace barely 20% of losses.
The arithmetic was complete. The industrial capacity of America and Britain combined was so far superior to German capacity that the outcome had never been in doubt. From the moment those 7,000 ships appeared on the horizon, the war had been decided.
The camp was run efficiently. The prisoners were fed according to Geneva Convention standards. The barracks were adequate. Medical care was available. It wasn't comfortable, but it was humane. For a man who'd spent 5 years at war, watching friends die, watching military situations deteriorate with mathematical inevitability, the American POW camp was almost civilized. What struck Kress most was the casual abundance. American guards smoked cigarettes without rationing them. The cooks served meals with meat in them, not as a luxury, but as a matter of course. At the end of the war, when Kress was released and returned to Germany, he discovered a country in ruins, entire cities reduced to rubble, starvation widespread, the infrastructure of civilization destroyed. He walked through Munich, where he'd stationed before the war. Most of the city was gone. The American bombing had been systematic and complete. Factories destroyed, government buildings destroyed, residential neighborhoods destroyed, tens of thousands dead. And yet, when Kress looked at the evidence of American bombing, he didn't see cruelty. He saw the reflection of American production capacity. The Americans had built enough bombers and enough bombs to reduce German cities to rubble, to destroy German industry, to eliminate the German capacity to wage war. The bombing had been ruthless, yes, but it had been ruthless in the service of something larger, the complete destruction of German military capacity. In 1952, 8 years after the war ended, Kress was interviewed by a German historian researching the campaign in Normandy. He was asked about D-Day, about his impressions, about the moment when he understood Germany had lost. "I knew when I saw the ships," Kress said simply. "I counted them that morning. 7,000 vessels, maybe more, each one carrying men or equipment, each one a representation of American industrial capacity." "You counted them?" the historian asked, skeptical. "I tried to," Kress said, "but the number became irrelevant after a few thousand. What mattered wasn't the specific number, it was understanding what that number meant." Which was that Germany had been defeated not by American soldiers or American generals or American tactics. We had better soldiers and better generals and better tactics than most of our enemies. We were defeated by American factories, by the decision that American society made to convert its entire productive capacity to the war effort. That decision was made years before I saw those ships on the horizon. The ships were just the physical manifestation of that decision." Kress paused, choosing his words carefully. "Every German soldier on that beach understood by the end of the first day that they couldn't win, not because they lacked courage or training, but because for every one of them standing in a defensive position, there were 10 Americans in boats heading toward them. And for every one of them holding a defensive line, there were 10 more Americans coming to replace the ones who fell." "Did you ever think Germany could have won?" the historian asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "No, not after 1942. Once the Soviets didn't collapse and the Americans entered the war, the question was no longer whether we would lose, but how long it would take us to lose. The Americans could build more tanks than we could build in a month in a single day. Their factories ran 24 hours. Ours ran when they weren't being bombed. They had no fuel shortage because they had oil from Mexico and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. We had to synthesize oil from coal, and the process was inefficient." "So you fought knowing you were going to lose?" "We fought because we were soldiers, because we were ordered to,
because surrender meant certain death in many cases. But yes, I fought knowing that eventually Germany would lose. The mathematics were clear. 7,000 ships on D-Day wasn't a surprise in terms of strategic outcome. It was confirmation of something that had already been decided in the offices of American industrialists and the chambers of American government. The historian pressed further. Did you ever consider that if Germany had made different strategic choices, the outcome might have been different? Perhaps. If Germany had somehow negotiated peace with the Soviet Union before entering the war with America, if German industry had been converted to war production in 1936 instead of 1939, if countless other decisions had been different. But all of those discussions are academic. Germany fought America on Americans' terms, a war of attrition, a war of production, a war where the ability to replace losses was the determining factor. And in that kind of war, Germany could never compete with American industrial capacity. By the late 1950s, Kress had settled into civilian life. He worked as an engineer, rebuilding German infrastructure. He married the woman he'd been writing to during the war. He raised a family. He lived quietly, never seeking attention or recognition. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, he would think back to that dawn on June 6, 1944. He would think about standing on the bluff at Pointe d'Oc, binoculars raised, watching the horizon fill with ships. He would think about the moment when he understood that Germany had already lost, that all of the courage and all of the determination and all of the military skill in the world couldn't overcome the simple fact that America could produce more tanks, more ships, more aircraft, more ammunition, more of everything than Germany could possibly destroy. In 1985, at a reunion of German and Allied veterans, Kress found himself sitting at a table with several American officers who'd been at D-Day. One of them, a colonel who'd commanded a landing craft group, asked Kress about his experiences. Kress told him about the ships, about the counting, about the realization. The American officer nodded. He said, "We didn't know if we could do it. The invasion was high risk. If you had stronger defenses, if your artillery had been better positioned, if you had air support, the outcome could have been very different." Perhaps. But you had already won by the time the ships appeared. Your government had decided to commit unlimited resources to the war effort. Your factories were producing more weapons than ours could destroy. Your pilots controlled the sky. Your engineers had designed better logistic systems. The invasion was just the final confirmation of something that had already been decided in the offices of American industrialists and the chambers of American government. The conversation drifted to other topics, but Kress found himself returning to the subject later. He was asked if he had any regrets about the war. "I regret that I didn't understand earlier," he said. "I was trained as a military officer, which meant I was trained to think in terms of tactics and strategy and operations, but I wasn't trained to think in terms of economics and production and industrial capacity. If I had understood those factors, I would have understood in 1939 that Germany couldn't win a war against America. The outcome was determined before the first shot was fired." "Yet you fought anyway," the American officer said. "Yes, because soldiers follow orders, because I had made an oath, because refusing to fight would have meant death in many cases. But yes, I fought knowing that eventually Germany would lose. The mathematics were clear. 7,000 ships on D-Day wasn't a surprise in terms of strategic outcome. It was confirmation of something that had already been decided in the offices of American industrialists and the chambers of American government." Kress died in 1971 at the age of 65. In his will, he left behind personal papers and journals, including his wartime notes.
These papers were eventually donated to a German military museum, where they became part of the historical record of D-Day and the Western Campaign. One particular entry from June 14, 1944, was selected for display. I have been studying the invasion forces and attempting to calculate their composition. Conservative estimates suggest 7,000 or more vessels of all types, carrying 180,000 troops in the initial assault. The Americans have achieved a degree of logistics and organizational capability that exceeds anything Germany has demonstrated. Every American soldier is equipped with more ammunition than a German soldier carries into battle. Every American artillery piece has access to more ammunition than German artillery has to an entire battle. The Americans have not simply brought more men, they have brought a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one based on overwhelming material advantage rather than tactical brilliance. This approach cannot be countered by traditional military means. Germany has lost this war, not today, not this week, but the mathematical inevitability is clear. When I look at those ships on the horizon, I am not looking at the